The first thing Warden Prime Eshkal noticed about the human was that it was humming. Not signaling, not processing. Humming, a low-tuned sound that rose and fell, with no apparent encoding, no information density, no purpose that Eshkal's analytical lattice could resolve. The human sat cross-legged on the floor of the detention pod, its back against the curve of the hull, and it hummed the same 6 notes over and over as though repeating them might eventually make them mean something. Eshkal recorded the behavior, tagged it vocal self-stimulation, possible neurological deficit, moved on. The human's name, according to the intake dossier compiled by the Hegemony's surface extraction team, was Matti Kekkonen. It had been a business administrator, a low-tier resource allocator for a regional shipping consortium on the third continent. Middle-aged, soft in the midsection, thinning hair, no military history. The extraction team had flagged it as civilian non-combatant, Category 7, negligible threat assessment. What Eshkal could not explain, and what would eat at him for the remaining 3 months of the occupation, was why they had brought Matti Kekkonen aboard at all. The answer, as it turned out, had to do with the serum. The Hegemony's bioengineering division had been working on cognitive suppression compounds for decades. The logic was elegant. If you could chemically reduce a species' higher reasoning faculties, not destroy them, just dial them back, render the subject pliant and easily managed, you could process occupied populations with a fraction of the usual enforcement overhead. No guards needed if the guarded don't remember why they should be angry. They had called it Compliance Serum 7 Gamma. The surface team had been testing its civilians for 6 weeks before the Warden Prime received the first anomalous report. Subject Kekkonen Matti, age 52. Administered a standard dose of 7 Gamma at 0400 local time, day 31 of the occupation. Expected behavioral profile, docility, reduced initiative, cooperative affect. Observed behavioral profile. Subject began laughing. Not the nervous laughter of a frightened animal, real laughter, deep and uncontrolled, the kind that bends a body double. Subject subsequently attempted to climb the exterior of the processing station. Was physically restrained. Restrained again. A third time. The restraining officer submitted a formal complaint. Subject was reclassified as non-standard response case, transported to orbital facility for observation. Eshkal had read the report twice and then gone to look at the human himself. Matti did not seem particularly troubled by being on an alien spacecraft. That was, Eshkal reflected, the first genuinely strange thing. Most humans they brought up went through a predictable sequence: terror denial, bargaining, a kind of hollow compliance. The threat of the unfamiliar crushed something in them, and what remained was cooperative enough. Kekkonen had skipped all of that. He sat in the detention pod with the placid curiosity of a child who has discovered a new room in a house he thought he knew completely. "What are these?" he asked, the first time Eshkal entered. He was pointing at the bioluminescent relay nodes along the ceiling, living tissue, faintly pulsing, part of the ship's distributed nervous system. Eshkal did not answer. He was here to observe, not to instruct. "They look the lights in a fish tank," Matti said. He nodded, apparently satisfied with this assessment. Nice. He went back to humming. Over the next 4 days, Eshkal observed him systematically. Matti ate with great enthusiasm and no dignity, dragging his fingers through the nutrient paste the Hegemony provided, and licking them clean with the frank pleasure of an animal. He slept 10 hours at a stretch, curled into a tight ball, and when he woke he stretched each limb individually, and with great deliberateness, like a man taking inventory of his body. He sang to himself. He pressed his face against the transparent observation port and fogged it with his breath and drew shapes in the fog with one finger before it faded. He tapped rhythms on the hull with no apparent pattern. He was also, Eshkal began to realize, paying very close attention to everything. Not with the tight surveillance of a spy, nothing so disciplined. More like the attention of someone who is interested in the world in a fundamental, inarticulate way. The way a child watches a beetle cross a stone. Pure noticing, unfiltered by agenda, it was deeply unsettling. The serum had done something to Matti's brain that the Hegemony's chemists could not fully account for. They had intended to suppress the prefrontal processing centers, the seat of long-term planning, abstract reasoning, social calculation, and it had done that more or less. Matty's capacity for strategic thinking was genuinely impaired. He could not hold a complex chain of logic in his head for more than a few seconds before it dissolved. What they had not anticipated was what lived underneath. Matti Kekkonen, before the serum, had been, by his own account, given cheerfully to anyone who asked, a dull man. He had been careful with money, cautious with people, allergic to disruption. He had managed a shipping ledger for 23 years, with competence, but no pleasure. He had gone home at the same time every evening. He had eaten the same 4 meals on rotation. He had been, as his wife Helena once said during an argument that he no longer clearly remembered, a man who had organized himself out of any feeling at all. The serum had taken the organization away. What it left behind was something in Matti Kekkonen's chest since childhood, waiting with the patience of geological time, an absolute, bottomless delight in being alive, a curiosity that asked questions without embarrassment, a stubbornness that had never needed logic to sustain itself, because it was not logical in origin. It was something older and simpler and harder to kill. The hegemony had intended to make him a manageable thing. They had instead removed the cage. On the 5th day, Matti figured out how to open the detention pod door. He did not do this through sophisticated analysis. He did it because he had been pressing things, every surface, every seam, every node and ridge and depression, with the patient, methodical curiosity of a toddler, and eventually one of the seams pressed back. The locking mechanism, designed to resist deliberate attack, had never been tested against someone who was simply very interested in everything. The corridor outside was empty. Eshkal had reduced the watch because the human was uncoordinated and non-threatening, and the ship was a closed system in deep space. Matti walked 300 meters before anyone found him. He was in the ship's secondary nutrient bay, sitting on the floor amid the soft, warm glow of the cultivation tanks, watching algae grow. "It moves," he said, when the guards arrived. He pointed at the algae, really slowly. "You have to wait, but it moves." They put him back in the pod. They upgraded the lock. 2 days later, he was in the navigation antechamber. Eshkal was called from his sleep cycle. He arrived to find Matti sitting at the dead interface console, an auxiliary station offline, its surface dark, pressing keys in a slow, deliberate sequence. Not random, the same sequence repeated, varied slightly each time, like someone trying to remember a song. "What are you doing?" Eshkal said. Matti looked up. His expression was one of mild surprise, as though he had not expected the room to contain anyone else. "Trying to find the on button," he said. "That console is offline. I know, but I'll find it eventually." Eshkal had him return to the pod again, and this time he went himself to the engineering deck and spoke at length with the ship's systems coordinator about containment protocols. The mistake Eshkal made, the mistake the Hegemony's entire occupation strategy made, was categorical. They had built their models of human behavior around human beings operating at peak cognitive function. Rational actors, strategic thinkers, beings who calculated risk and reward and threat assessment before acting. That was the human they had prepared for. That was the human the serum was supposed to produce in diminished form. A rational actor with degraded rationality, a thinking being that had been made to think less well. They had never modeled this, because a rational actor confronted with an alien warship in deep space does the math. The math says, you are one unarmed mammal against a crew of 40 engineered beings with lethal capability on a vessel you cannot operate in a void you cannot survive. The math says, be still, be cooperative, wait for rescue that may not come. Matti Kekkonen could no longer do the math. All he had left was the thing that had always been underneath the math. A bone-deep incapacity to simply sit still when there were interesting things to look at. The critical juncture arrived on day 11. Matti had, by that point, escaped confinement 7 times. He had been found in the following locations: the nutrient bay twice, the navigation antechamber, the crew hygiene station, a maintenance crawl space that the chief engineer had not known existed, the Warden Prime's own observation deck, inexplicably in the external equipment bay, which was pressurized but adjacent to vacuum and accessible only through 3 sequential airlocks. He had not done anything in any of these places. He had only looked. But on day 11, in the navigation antechamber, he had pressed the right sequence. The auxiliary console came online. Matty had not known it would. He had not been looking for the navigation system. He had not understood that finding the navigation system was the kind of thing one might be trying to do. He had simply been interested in the console and interested in buttons, and had eventually found the combination that the console recognized as an initialization sequence because it happened to correspond to the harmonic rhythm he had been tapping on hull surfaces for 11 days. A rhythm he had been tapping because it matched a song his mother had sung to him when he was very small. The console came online and displayed a real-time star map of the surrounding sector, including the location of the Hegemony fleet. Including the location of the human resistance fleet, which the Hegemony did not know had been tracking them for 9 days. Matty looked at the star map for a long time. "Pretty," he said. Then he pressed another button. What Matti Kekkonen pressed was the ship's long-range broadcast transmitter, configured, because the auxiliary console was a legacy system, to an open-frequency default that Hegemony protocol had never bothered to encrypt, because no one had used open broadcast in decades. It was, by any rational standard, a vulnerability so obvious that no rational actor would ever exploit it, because no rational actor would ever stumble across it while looking for the on button. The signal went out on the frequency the human resistance had been monitoring for exactly this kind of anomaly. Matty did not transmit a message. He transmitted what he always transmitted when he had access to a sound system. He hummed. 6 notes repeated the fragment of a melody that had no name he could remember. He hummed it for 4 minutes before the guards arrived and pulled him away from the console. The resistance signals officer who received the transmission needed 11 seconds to identify the frequency, 7 more to triangulate the source, and approximately 1 minute to convince her commanding officer that what they were receiving was deliberate contact from an asset aboard the flagship. It was not deliberate. Matty had no idea he had done anything remarkable. But the fleet had a fix on the flagship now, and the flagship was, by the laws of orbital mechanics, exactly where the resistance needed it to be. Eshkal came to the pod himself this time. He stood at the entrance and looked at the human sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming, and he felt for the first time since the assignment had begun something that his analytical lattice could not easily classify. Not quite fear, something adjacent to it, the recognition of a pattern he did not have the framework to fully process. "Why?" he said. Matty looked up. "Why what? Why do you keep doing this? You gain nothing. You cannot escape. You cannot survive outside this ship. You cannot reach your people. You cannot operate this vessel. What is the purpose?" Matty thought about this for a moment with the earnest, effortful expression of a man doing arithmetic he hasn't practiced recently. "I'm not trying to do anything," he said. "I just want to see what's there. That is not rational. Probably not." He seemed untroubled by this. "Is it important to be rational?" Eshkal opened his mouth and closed it. In 40 years of hegemony service across 11 occupations of 7 species, no one had ever asked him that. "Yes," he said. "Okay," Matty said. He thought for another moment. "I just don't think I am right now, but I'm enjoying it." Eshkal returned to his station and filed a revised threat assessment. For the first time in the occupation, he marked a Category 7 civilian non-combatant as requiring immediate behavioral suppression. He submitted the recommendation to Hegemony Command for authorization. The authorization took 9 hours to process. The resistance fleet arrived in 6. What the history of the occupation would later record in documents recovered after the Hegemony's eventual withdrawal, translated with some difficulty, argued over extensively in academic publications over the following decades, was that the flagship had been caught completely flat-footed at the moment of the resistance fleet's attack. The Hegemony commander had, according to internal communications, been in the middle of reviewing a behavioral suppression authorization for a single Category 7 civilian. The flagship's navigation system had been in an anomalous state, partially initialized through the auxiliary console, broadcasting on open frequency, which meant that the standard pre-combat lockdown procedures failed to initialize correctly. A 15-second gap in defensive shielding during what should have been a routine escalation sequence. 15 seconds was enough. The human histories told it differently. The human histories had a name for what Matty had done, though Matty himself would have found the name baffling. They called it the Kekkonen transmission. They talked about deliberate strategy, careful planning, a man who had understood exactly what he was doing every step of the way. Matty, when asked by a journalist some years later, had scratched his head and said he didn't remember most of it very clearly. He remembered the lights in the ceiling that looked like a fish tank. He remembered the algae moving, really slowly if you waited. He remembered a console with a lot of buttons and the satisfying feeling of pressing them. He remembered humming. Helena Kekkonen had not expected to see her husband again. She had assumed, as had most people in their district, that the ones taken to the orbital facility did not come back. When the Resistance fleet boarded the flagship and began processing the occupants, she was in the regional Coordination Center, helping to organize medical triage for the first wave of liberated prisoners. Matty walked in 40 minutes after the all-clear. He looked, Helena thought, different. Not thinner, not more haunted, different in a way she found difficult to articulate, easier, somehow, less carefully arranged. He had always held himself with the posture of a man who was conscious of being observed and wanted to be seen doing everything correctly. Now he stood in the doorway of the Coordination Center and looked around with the simple, happy curiosity of someone who has arrived somewhere new and is interested in what they'll find. He saw Helena and his face did something uncomplicated. "Hi, Matty," she said. What happened to you up there?" He thought about it. "I looked at a lot of things," he said. "It was interesting." She crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he hugged her back with more sincerity than he had managed in several years, she thought. She did not know about the serum, or the 7 escapes, or the open-frequency broadcast, or the 15-second gap in defensive shielding. She did not know that 40 years of hegemony tactical planning had been undone in part by her husband's inability to sit still. She just held him and felt, for the first time in weeks, that something had gone right. "Come on," he said, when she let go. "I want to get something to eat." "I've been thinking about food for 11 days, she laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes when something releases, when tension you had stopped noticing suddenly goes. She was still laughing when they walked out into the pale afternoon. Eshkol survived the battle. He was processed with the rest of the flagship's crew, held for 6 months in a resistance facility, eventually repatriated as part of the armistice negotiations. He wrote his memoirs 20 years later, a dry, technical document mostly of interest to military historians. One passage was quoted extensively in every review. "The human Kekkonen was not a weapon. He had no plan. He operated by no doctrine I could identify. He was simply a being that had been reduced, by our own chemical intervention, to the purest expression of his nature, and his nature, stripped of all strategic overlay, was an absolute refusal to be uninterested in the world around him. This is what we had failed to model. We had catalogued human ingenuity, human aggression, human adaptability. We had not understood that underneath all of these is something more fundamental, a species that finds the universe inexhaustibly interesting and cannot be made to stop investigating it, not by confinement, not by void, not by the complete absence of any rational reason to continue. I should note that Kekkonen, when I attempt to speak with him briefly at the armistice signing, did not remember my name. He had found a loose thread on his ceremonial jacket and was pulling at it with great concentration. I do not know what this means. I suspect it means exactly what it appears to mean. The thread came away. Matty examined it, decided it was interesting, and put it in his pocket for later. Then he looked up at the ceiling of the signing chamber, where the light fixtures were doing something that caught his attention, and he watched them for a while, and he was happy. Outside, the last of the Hegemony ships were folding into transit. The occupation was over. No one had told Matti, but he would have found that interesting too.